Cells. In this unit, we'll be talking about prokaryotes versus eukaryotes. Now, before we talk about whether something is a prokaryote or a eukaryote, we should discuss whether something is living. Now, there is a term, biotic versus abiotic. We're primarily concerned about biotic, meaning something that is alive. But what counts as alive? There are things like stalactites and stalagmites in caves that do, in fact, grow over time. Do they count as alive? And so we're now going to explore what does it mean for something to count as living. A little quick history. Mid 1600s, Robert Hooke improved on compound microscopes, and one of the first things he decided to take a look at was a slice of cork. And when he looked in the cork, he said he thought he saw something that looked like little prison cells. And this is how cells got their names. I actually heard a different version of the story, which is he thought it looks like the cells that monk lived in. Um, the thing that's long past, we don't really have those kind of things anymore. Monks used to like to put themselves in little rooms to meditate and contemplate. And so that was the version I heard. Regardless, when he did this, he discovered and came up with the name cells. As another little tidbit, if any of you are just looking at this going, oh, guy who discovered a cell, Robert Hooke was an incredible scientist. He did far more than just discovered a cell. He is actually also a contemporary to Isaac Newton. In fact, he and Isaac Newton had one of the biggest rivalries in scientific history. The story I gave before, and I'll give it here again, it's legendary at this point, so God knows if it's even true anymore. But Isaac Newton supposedly, out of spite, once told Robert Hooke he already figured out how the orbits of certain planets were. Because at the time, they didn't understand how to predict the exact path of planets. And so Robert Hooke gleefully challenged him, saying, oh, well, you said you did, so can you prove it to us? Out of sheer spite, Isaac Newton went back to his summer cottage and invented calculus over the summer. That's how spiteful this man was. He used his genius to invent calculus just so he could get back at his rival. So we can talk more about this, but Robert Hooke was no small time guy, right? Isaac Newton's huge in history. Robert Hooke honestly should be up there, and I think the only reason he isn't is because Isaac Newton made sure that he tried to really try to just talk him down, and I think it might have worked to some degree. All right, so now let's talk about what is the cell theory and the definition of life. So we're going to ignore atoms for now, but when we expand the levels of organization, you'll see that there's a lot more. We only covered up to organism, which is a single major living thing usually. Then we have population, community, ecosystem, and biosphere. Those are actually going to be covered in a later unit called ecology. Cells are going to be considered the smallest and simplest unit of life. Now, consider this. If I say anything that's living at all, what we break it down, at what point it is still alive? And that's what you need to think about when we say it's the simplest, smallest unit of life. It's not the simplest thing ever. Atoms are clearly smaller. But at that point, we don't consider atoms living because they're not doing certain things that constitute what we think of as living. So, things get bigger, generally speaking, as well as more complex as we climb further and further up that level of hierarchy of organization. As we said before, because of the definition, an implication comes out. All living things are made of cells. This is a very important rule. Um, this is one of those major laws in biology. If you say, well, something is alive, it's probably made of cells. Now, there are two types, prokaryotic and eukaryotic. We're going to talk a little bit more about that. But we haven't gotten done talking about what cells must do. We know that all things are made of living cells, right? Or all living things are made of cells. So, first thing we have to know is that a cell, anything that's considered living, but specifically now the rules of what makes a cell, right? This is cell theory. It has to independently metabolize energy to power life processes. There's a lot to unpack here. The first to say is that when we say independently, it means that it can't rely on other things. It has to use its own resources, its own abilities, right? There are some things that can somehow, well, we can talk about details and examples later, but they have to be able to do this on their own, okay? That's what independently means. Metabolize, in this case, is talking about chemical processes, especially biochemical processes. Anytime you hear metabolism, it could mean burning fats. It could mean digesting glucose and turning it into sugar. That's cellular respiration. There's a lot more than that, but those are the most common ones you'll know at this stage. So, metabolize in this case is specifically talking about creating that energy. So, if you're thinking mitochondria because of a previous lesson, you're in the right spot. Now, metabolizing energy to power life processes. So they have to be able to basically come up with their own energy. That's what this translates into. I'll summarize again. The first rule for all cells to be alive is that they have to be able to essentially create their own energy. Before I get onto rule number two, um, normally I would have zero problems showing the image. It's a diagram depicting a fully nude human body of a male and female. To me, at this point, you should be learning that when we're talking about biology and anatomy, that you have to separate your normal colloquial and everyday brain and partition that off from an academic mind. You shouldn't be, aiming to be a doctor if every time you see human body parts, you just want to get into a fit of giggles or turn red from embarrassment. You're going to have to learn to objectively look at it as a medical professional, right? And it's the same for us for biology. We're going to be talking about a lot of things that normal humans won't want to talk about because of social etiquette and things like that. But in biology, we should be used to it. The reason I'm not showing it right now is because I realize we never actually sent out any waivers for your parents and you to sign off saying, yeah, it's okay for you to see this stuff. It is in the end still a social contract that we have to be aware of. So, as a side note, if you see me like censoring this stuff, I'll probably send out something back to parents saying, hey, can I show your kids this stuff? For me, it's, you know, biologically, medically prudent that you get used to seeing these images and seeing these kind of things. Not necessary right now. This is an image I think left behind by previous teachers, Miss Meyer particularly, I believe. I think that's where Mr. Vo got this image from. All right, actually onward to rule number two now. Rule number two is that all cells must come from pre-existing cells by reproducing. Now, there are two kinds. We're not going to get into it right now, but just be aware that there is both sexual reproduction and asexual reproduction. If you're curious, because especially it's the term sexual and asexual. Colloquially, this means a lot of other things. However, in biology, sexual simply means you needed two sets of genes. But usually, the most basic definition, a male set of genes and a female set of genes. In particular, some people will get even more specific and say it's specific to gametes, usually male gametes like sperm and female gametes like eggs. Asexual, however, it's kind of cool, is that essentially they reproduce by just growing double of everything and then splitting off. It'd be crazy if a human did that. If a human reproduced asexually, they would have at some point four arms, four legs, two heads, double everything, and then somehow eventually just go blop, and now there's two of them. It is effectively cloning. And so asexual reproduction has benefits, but by far and large, we'll eventually talk about this in genetics, is that sexual reproduction seems to have by far more benefits than not. Anyway, just to explain this a little bit more, reproduction is the main thing. So if you were to summarize the first rule, it is that metabolism is the first rule. Has to be able to do that on its own, right? There's a lot more other rules. Has to be on its own, has to be able to create energy, but it's metabolism. It's one word. The second rule's one word summary would be reproduction. Has to be able to create more of its own, right? We can call it species, we can call it cloning or whatever else, but it has to be able to create another life. Then there's rule number three: all cells must communicate with its environment to maintain homeostasis. Now, I will say, myself, I prefer the word interaction because communicate sounds like you either have to talk or there has to be nerves or senses or chemical electrical signals, right? And that's where a lot of colloquial brains will go. Communicate is not the wrong word in biology. I just think interaction makes more sense because a lot of people might walk away saying, oh, all cells have to be able to talk or have to be able to feel. No, that's not the case. They just simply have to be able to react. Interact means that they can, either move forward, go, touch things, change things around them, or whenever things like rain or acid come into the environment or it gets too warm, they start reacting to it. And that's what this communicate with its environment means. Now, homeostasis, this is an important aspect. They don't just do that for no reason. They're doing it specifically to maintain homeostasis. We've already dropped this term a few times in this unit. Please remember that when I say homeostasis, we're simply talking about balance. We want the cell to remain the same. If you eat too much sugar, your body tries to get rid of it. If you're too uh, thirsty, it's because you have too little water in your system. So homeostasis is your body coming up with ways to let you know, hey, I need more water in here. So you start feeling thirsty. You're like, I really want to get a drink of water, right? Or if it's too hot, you start sweating to help evaporate some water off your skin so that you can get that heat off of there. And this is what this means. This is ways for your body or cell in this case to interact with the environment and get rid of the, too much of something or get replace things because there was too little of it. This is what this particular means. If you were to say, well, what's the one word rule for rule number three? The one word is interaction or communication. Mr. Vo helpfully left in an example of this, how you have, we'll eventually talk about this in more detail, different kinds of solutions which causes cells to react differently. This means that the exchange and transport of nutrients and sending of waste out into the environment is actually a part of this communication. Again, you're not just sitting there doing nothing, you're interacting with the things outside. So you're taking in nutrients, you're hunting for those nutrients, and you're gathering them into your body, and then you're removing the waste by putting it out. And then, of course, there is the respond and adapt to changing environment. There are many, many things that an animal or plant, most living things, in fact, will do to respond. As I mentioned before, if it gets too hot or you yourself, you're too thirsty, there are biological systems in place that try to prevent you from going too far so that you can avoid it. One of the main reasons, as the picture, as the animation below shows from SpongeBob, that you have that kind of reactions to smells that are unpleasant is because generally speaking, those unpleasant smells mean something is bad. There's either toxins in the air that's not good to eat, or it's a warning sign that you should stay away because there's some dangerous thing that's going to happen. Your biology has picked up on these and realized they're not good for you, so you should probably not touch them. All right, so there is a fourth rule now, and that is that cells must be able to grow, as in build more structures. Now, the word grow is actually used, I believe, in the original definitions that was created 500 years ago now. Um, but we have to be careful because, again, there's a difference between colloquial, everyday language, and academic language. In colloquial language, grow can mean a lot of things. So we might be able to say, oh, does this count as growing? Does that count as growing? However, what we mean by that is you have a repeatable and accurate process to build more of themselves. If it's not already clear from the pictures below, we are almost explicitly talking about DNA replication and protein synthesis. And so those are usually the beginning process of what we mean by grow. So if you're like, oh, well, those crystals grow, after a while, if you have a chemical, mineral water drip on them, they will eventually get bigger and bigger. Does that count as growing? In this case, we're being much more specific. It has to be a repeatable, accurate process to build more of themselves. And so while it's not only DNA replication that counts, we have to consider that, for example, we all know that human babies grow and become human adults. We know that puppies turn into dogs. And so they have to be able to grow. They have to grow more hair. They have to grow more skin cells if they get scratched, right? These are all things that we consider growing. And so all of it relies on DNA replication as well as protein synthesis, that kind of thing. We'll get into much more detail, but for now, you really should not consider something as growing just because it got bigger. If I tell you I blew a balloon up full of air, does that count as growing? In this case, you should answer no. So here's a summary slide. For those of you taking notes, it might be useful to just list them all out as a singular set of rules. What's considered alive? Now, this one's a bit tricky. Not only do you have to list all of the rules, you have to really understand what they mean. So if I give you an example of something that's possibly alive, and you have to ask, well, is it actually, right? If I tell you just a plastic bag that's reacting to the air around it and it's floating in air and it's moving around, it's interacting, isn't it? And you have to be able to say, not really, because it's just being tossed around by the air. It's not changing its own movement. It's not responding to it. It's not gathering nutrients. It's not trying to maintain some kind of balance inside of it. Because that's what we were talking about when we said it's responding to the environment, right? So this part communicating down here, we can't just say a plastic bag being affected by the wind counts, right? That's where you have to begin to understand. And so we'll throw a lot of these examples at you, and you have to be able to understand that they whether they fit or don't fit these rules. But the trick is, for life to count as life, it has to do all four of these. This is going to be very tricky, especially when we start moving into some crazier examples as we slowly expand our understanding of science. Viruses become a huge question. And another one is prions. We'll talk about this in more detail, but in my opinion, one of the most amazing parts of science when you start looking at things like viruses and prions and going, how in the world can it do what it's doing? And now we are going over four main differences between the aforementioned prokaryotes versus eukaryotes. Now, prokaryotes, as very general rules, are much smaller and less complex. The first rule I will tell you don't stick to, it's 99% true, but there are times when you'll see bacteria that are so big that even eukaryotes are small and dwarf in size compared to them. But because prokaryotic cells are, number two, unicellular, this rule makes absolutely sure that the moment a eukaryotic cell becomes uh, multicellular, like it's a combination of hundreds, thousands, even millions of, or billions or trillions of cells, then yeah, prokaryotic cells are just going to be much smaller. But when we're talking about only a single cell, rule number one is not nearly as clear. Rule number three is they don't have membrane bound organelles. If you look over here, the only things you'll ever see are a squiggle for a chromosome, and this is generally bunched up together in a place called a nucleoid, not a nucleus. It's not protected by a membrane at all. And then they have smaller bits of DNA called plasmids. We're not going to cover this into too much detail because this detail is talking about bacteria, and they usually have like little hair-like things called cilia or maybe even a flagellum, but that's about it. You don't, if you see it under a microscope, you won't see smaller packets or partitioned off areas, and those are membrane bound. They're literally covered by a little extra membrane. So since they don't have that, they're usually you should be able to very quickly say, well, that's a prokaryote. And the members of this group are bacteria and a group called archaea bacteria. There is actually a lot of debate whether archaea even belongs in prokaryotes, etc. But generally speaking, for all intents and purposes, just say bacteria and archaea, and we're all good. One of the reasons Mr. Vo has a volcano over here is because archaea show a very, very weird set of traits. I'm not going to go into detail here, but because of their traits and because of when you can find them and because of like fossil records, the cells are very hard to find fossil records are of, and we can talk about that in more detail. But because of all those data adding up, we think they're some of the oldest living things on Earth. And that we can't find them anymore on Earth except for extreme places, usually extremely acidic places, extremely hot places like near volcanic vents or even volcanoes themselves, um, in extremely cold places like bottom of the ocean, and that's when you start finding them. Bacteria, however, are everywhere. So, archaea is, I forget if it's Greek or Roman, means ancient. All right. So, organelle, what is an organelle? The slide here just gives you a giant list. So, if any of you want even more detail about what each one is and what they're for, well, here you go. There's even more information. And I'm not necessarily going to use these for the testing, where I'm going to prefer towards what Mr. Vo had in the other slide. However, it's not bad. It's a good rehash of the information we had. It doesn't really tell you what an organelle by itself is. And so a lot of people like to say, well, it's basically like organs of a cell. So when you think of it that way, organ of a cell, you can shorten it to organelle. That's a lot of ways, a way a lot of people will memorize that. So that's the way I just want you to think about it. Um, Organelle is technically just a smaller structure within the cell. And it very specifically generally means it's membrane bound. It doesn't necessarily have to be, but it is usually in that sense that we're thinking about membrane bound. It has something that helps keep everything inside. So now we're going to talk about eukaryotic cells. These are much larger, more complex, and they're multicellular. They also contain membrane bound organelles. If you remember what we talked about prokaryotes, you remember now that this is the same 3 points, except it's the opposite. Prokaryotes were smaller, simpler. They were unicellular, meaning a single cell, versus now multicellular. And they didn't have membrane bound organelles, but eukaryotic here does. So keep that in mind. If we show you an image that looks more like this and looks like there's, again, small partitions in here, little membrane bound pieces here and there, it is very likely a eukaryotic cell. And that's when we get animals, plants, fungi, and in eukaryotes, they do have small unicellular organisms like this. This is where it might get weird. I'll be telling you about, hey, it's a single cell organism. It's very small. Um, so you're like, well, it's not multicellular. The point here about multicellular is that eukaryotes almost overwhelmingly are multicellular, but there are some exceptions. Again, when we start teaching you these rules and talking about it, first we have to be able to quickly understand what the rules are. But as soon as you start studying deeper and deeper into the issues, you realize there's a lot more of a gray edge to everything than just, haha, this is an easy way to memorize. Right now, at middle school, we don't need to go further than this, but keep in mind that this example down here very much says, well, that's not multicellular. No, but we mean 99.9% of the time, you're not going to be confused if I say, hey, look at this. It's a cricket. Immediately, you should be like, oh, eukaryote. That's not even a question. There's nothing that big that can be a prokaryote. All right, so this is the nucleus. This is the key structural difference. As I mentioned before, usually you'll see something that looks like a nucleus because it's just a bunch of DNA just hobbled together like that. So prokaryotes have no nucleus. A lot of people think about that. Pro actually means first. So when we were originally naming these as Western tradition holds, pro meant first. They were like, oh, they're the first cells. Eu meaning new, they're the new cells, right? That's actually what prokaryote and eukaryotes are. But for a memorization tool, you can say pro sounds like no, so they have no nucleus. And this is the biggest reason you say there's a difference. If there's a lot of similarities, which sometimes you'll find, there are in fact things that seem like they really should be a prokaryote, but because they have a nucleus, that changes it. Now we say they're eukaryote. Okay. Now keep in mind, what's the nucleus? A lot of people like saying it's the cell's brain, supercomputer. I, it's not a bad way to think about it. My personal preference, this is Mr. Tong, Mr. Q, Mr. Qadri, I don't prefer that one. Because a lot of people are like, it thinks. No, it doesn't really do any of that. A cell is much more of like just a bunch of automated proteins, really. They don't really have thought. It is true that If you say, for example, oh, I felt something hot, it sent a signal to my brain sends a signal back to change it. In that sense, yes, it's kind of like that. But I don't like to think of it that way because then you start really glossing over what the nucleus actually does. Myself, I prefer to say the nucleus is like a library. It's a bunch of codes of what to do. And so when the cell gets something activated, it runs to the library, checks up the code for what to do, and then follows the instructions. That's a much better analogy in my mind for what's actually going on so you understand how cells work. But if you want to just be a little bit more broad, you can say, yeah, it's like the brain supercomputer. More importantly, no, like I said, it's the library, so it needs protection. This is why a membrane-bound organelle pretty useful. And this is also why we have found ways to kill bacteria, but not your own cells. You can eat stuff that kill bacteria, but it doesn't really damage you because we have protection over things like our DNA and bacteria don't. There is also another key difference, and that is that there is something what we call a continuous membrane with the endoplasmic reticulum, and it has this double membrane feature where it's almost like it's two membranes. Um, we haven't really gone into detail of this yet, but if you can't tell, this is already to what we call a bi um, bipolar. What's it called? It's a bilayer. It's two layers of these fatty cells that create essentially a double layer. Now, it double membranes over that, and that's what this part means, is that the endoplasmic reticulum usually almost sheathes the nucleus because anything the nucleus does, sending out RNA and whatever, goes directly into the ER. So when we talk about proteins and how they're getting created, if they go straight into the ER, that's how. So it goes straight again from the nucleus directly into the ER, and this is the ER right here. So if you were to look at these little black holes, that's what we're talking about with this pore. So anything that comes out of the nucleus, like an RNA, would go straight into here, directly into this complex of the ER. Doesn't give them much choice. They have to go through it, making it very, very easy for them to process and make sure it's always going through the same way. All right, we've been talking about differences. Now, here are some similarities. And before I go into this, I just want to list that some people were like, well, why are we talking about similarities? It's more important to differentiate. Well, yes and no, because like you'll see in our FRQs, there are a lot of reasons sometimes you'll see in our FRQs and like some of the more difficult questions. If you go on to reality, it's not so, as I said before, it's not so straight cut as, oh, here's black and white, eukaryotes versus prokaryotes. You have to sit there and understand, well, what really makes the difference? So when you look at similarities, you're able to go, okay, sometimes there might be some insect or some whatever that has a cell, and those cells look suspiciously like prokaryotic, but they're actually still eukaryotic. So the first similarity is the cell membrane, also known as the plasma membrane. This is an organelle. We consider it an organelle. It's like how we consider our skin an organ. It's selectively permeable. It only lets some things in and out of the cell. It's considered, if you want to think about it like the door, right? And I don't personally prefer, I've seen this a lot before. It's not the only place Mr. Vo is using door, but I don't prefer that because even though it has some function of a door, it's covering the whole body. So it's better to think other analogies because it's not even like the skin. Human skin blocks almost everything out. Very rarely does liquid even be able to escape out of your skin, right? That's only through sweat, specialized skin cells. Um, the membrane is much less like skin. It's much more like if you had a towel for a skin. Water can slowly seep right through. It doesn't get through right away, but it can seep right through. And even though it blocks some air, you could push air hard enough that it'll go through a towel. That's how you have to think of a cell membrane. That's a much better analogy. It's still not great. There's cell membrane does way more than that. So for me, using simpler analogies like a door is problematic, but that's just my preference. It's not wrong to think it's like a door because at your level, you're thinking, oh, does it let things in or out? That's what it does, right? It's kind of like a bouncer. All right, so cell walls, also considered an organelle, helps protect and give shape. We should have covered this in the organelle side, and it made of various sugars. And plant bacteria and fungi have these, not so much animals. The main strength of cell walls is that it protects really, really, really high protection compared to cell membranes. Cell membranes, if you want to think about it, is essentially just this, um, I don't know, like balloon skin. It's very thin. It's very, well, relatively thin, and it's flexible. You can push it around. But a cell wall is closer to like the outside of your um, lunchbox, right? It's tough. You kind of holds a shape. You can't really unshape it, like what are they called? The plastic containers for your leftovers, right? And that's what cell wall is. And this is similar for both. It's the same kind of structure for both protists or prokaryotes as well as eukaryotes. They also share in ribosomes. We consider this an organelle, right? It's I'll have to do. It's ribosomes are not actually membrane bound. They're basically large proteins, and they're involved in protein synthesis. And when we talk about the rough endoplasmic reticulum, it's just because it has all these bumps on it, and that's because it's just embedded ribosomes, as we talked about in the other slide deck. But these guys are also in prokaryotes, and one of the main reasons is because, well, look, they're not actually membrane bound; they're just a giant protein. That's it. So it doesn't break the rule of them having an organelle. Same with the cell wall. Same with the cell membrane. Those aren't technically membrane bound organelles. It's not technically. So it doesn't break that rule at all. Finally, as we mentioned before, even though they don't have a nucleus, prokaryotes and eukaryotes both have DNA that store genetic information. Now, I will mention that, as I said in an earlier slide, be careful. Don't just think they both have the same pile of DNA. They just have DNA. Okay. It's not quite the same in both. As mentioned here, prokaryotic cells have circular chromosomes. Those are called plasmids. I'll have to look that up just to make sure. Anyway, it was in the earlier slide as well. Eukaryotic slides have denser, larger chromosomes. And we'll talk about that when we get to genetics. We're more concerned about these guys. But when you study prokaryotic cells, it's similar, but not 100%. And the way they package their DNA gives them a lot of benefits, but also a lot of weaknesses, which again, we'll talk about more in genetics. For now, just know that they both share a genetic material called DNA. All right, as a fun little aside, this is something that is just, to me, one of the coolest ideas that exist out there is that there was an ancestral prokaryote. And eventually it's just for whatever reason was trying to form like some kind of protection around the all the new the plas the sorry the DNA and stuff, and so this becomes quote unquote infolding. Now there are some ancient bacteria that were maybe really good at creating a lot of energy, some of them really good at collecting sunlight, and they eventually get swallowed up by this larger prokaryote, but they don't eat him. They realize that actually, if I just kind of let them sit in here, they produce a lot of energy. All I have to do is just keep feeding it. And so they start having this symbiosis. That's what's called endosymbiosis. You have symbiosis going on. You have a lot of bacteria in your guts that if you killed, you would have diarrhea all the time because the bacteria help you digest so many foods. In particular, there is a type of bacteria that really helps with lactose, the stuff that you find in milk. So you killing those means that suddenly you drinking milk makes you feel nauseated, makes you want to go to the bathroom a lot more because those bacteria are gone and they can't digest it, so it just upsets your intestines. Um, in this case, it would be like, well, now you have something symbiotically living and doing something really good for the bigger cell while the smaller cell is being protected. It no longer has to worry about predators or acidic changes or whatever else. This larger cell will take care of it by protecting them and maintaining homeostasis. So, uh, this proposition came a while back, and it's not really proven. It's just that, well, it's pretty true probably. And one of the evidences of that is that mitochondria actually has its own set of DNA. And this is why if you look at any human being and you ask, oh, what are they more of? They're actually probably always a percentage more from their mother because mitochondrial DNA does not get passed down through the sperm. It gets passed down specifically when the baby is being developed in the womb. and the mother's blood is starting to come into play, and all that DNA starts mixing. So the mitochondria usually gets inherited from the mother. So this is why they call there's mitochondrial DNA. You can trace it, and it goes through from you to your mother to her mother to her mother to her mother, and you can have a straight line tracing back. And it's actually a very reliable way to trace ancestry. All right, as usual, here's a study sheet. When you're studying this material, there is now a lot more conceptual rather than memorization. There are still memorization. You have to go ahead and try to list and explain the five, says 5 requirements for living organism. I should change that to 4, so I apologize. Hopefully it'll be changed by the time you guys are actually looking at the notes. You then also have to explain the differences between prokaryotes and eukaryotes, as well as the similarities. Most of your difficult questions coming out from the tier 2, the 30% of your test, is that see if you look at cells, can you tell whether A, it's living, and B, if it's prokaryotic or eukaryotic? So to test that, there is a practice exam. Be interested in doing it at the end of class. All right, good luck.